Today's question has to do with Bible study.
Hmm.
When we study our Bibles, let's say one book from the Old Testament and one book from the New Testament, are we supposed to study them in the same way, or are there differences between the two on how we study?
Yeah. Well, there are similarities, but there are a lot of dissimilarities in approach to an Old Testament book and a New Testament book. Let me just mention several things that come into view. Uh, the Bible itself is a collection of books. It's 66 books, and it's not one book. So each of these books is unique. There are some books like other books, like the four gospel accounts are pretty much similar, except for the fact that John is a theological consideration of the gospel, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic in their approach or giving a synopsis of the life of Jesus. In the Old Testament, you have books of wisdom, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, various things. My point here is that you do have various types of literature in the Bible. So it is true to say each genre or each category has its own unique approach to it. A good example of that is if you're studying an Old Testament book like Proverbs, you're going to know about parallelism because a lot of Proverbs is really two lines that relate to each other. They're parallel to each other. So you need to know kind of how do you interpret that, whether it's a restatement or a contrast or an extension of the first line and the second line, or historical narrative, or so on and so forth. So my point here, and it's hard to get to it, is learn how do you approach each literary category for what it has to say. Now, the New Testament, for the most part, is letters, it's history, and it's things that are written straightforwardly. So you just read it, and you need to understand what he's just saying. I know some people have struggled with that, but that's your approach to it. There is Jude would have a few little pieces that might be a little more difficult, and certainly the last book of the Bible, Revelation, is apocalyptic in nature. That has it's a different animal altogether. So you have to know kind of how you approach that type of book to interpret that properly. Having said that, you can use similar principles no matter where you are in the Bible. Who's talking? To whom is he talking? What is he essentially saying? Why does he say it? And what's the point? And you can read a passage no matter wherever you are and usually pick that up. You're going to have questions. Like if you're in the Old Testament law, is this for Israel in the Old Testament or is this for everybody? And one of the most important things that we need to understand as Christians is the use of the law in a New Testament context from the Old Testament. And that's why we talk about ceremony and civil and moral law. And that's an artificially imposed grid, but it is helpful. Rule of thumb is if you have a moral principle that's stated even in Leviticus, it's going to be restated in the New Testament, usually in a broader sense, and it carries over. So you look at those things and you figure it out. You just figure it out. Does that apply to me? If so, where does the New Testament say that applies to me? And you look for corollaries. You look for Jesus' teachings in the New Testament. And I'm dealing here with the Old Testament stuff, morals. All of that comes into play. As you know, I've taught an entire class on how you do that. So there's a lot that comes into play here. But the primary thing is to notate the kind of material you're interpreting and apply guidelines that relate to that and look for what's being said, who's saying it, to whom he's saying it, and how it applies in a context. Usually you'll be able to figure that out. And especially if you're in the Old Testament, comparing it with the New Testament, what the New Testament says about the same kind of thing.
Thank you,
You're
Pastor.
welcome.